You have probably noticed it without quite registering what you were noticing. The yard gets louder in the morning, settles into its usual afternoon rhythm, and then at some point, and you cannot always say exactly when, it goes quiet. Not the sudden silence of a hawk overhead, that electric freeze that drops over a flock all at once. Something slower than that, something that settles in gradually like the light changing. The chickens pull in from the edges of the yard, the foraging slows. The usual chatter, the soft contact calls, the ongoing commentary that a healthy flock produces constantly, drops away. And maybe an hour later, sometimes two, the sky opens up. You probably wrote it off the first time. Coincidence? But it keeps happening, and at some point you start to wonder whether your chickens actually know something, and if they do, how. They do know something. And the mechanism behind it, once you understand it, will make you look at your flock differently every time the weather starts to turn. Welcome back. Subscribe before you leave because this one goes deeper than weather prediction. It gets into how chickens actually experience the physical world around them, and some of what they can detect will genuinely surprise you. Before we get into the how, it is worth being precise about what the behavior actually looks like, because different parts of it have different explanations, and they are all worth separating out. The quiet that descends on a flock before rain is not one thing. It is several things happening in sequence, often so close together that they blend into a single impression of the flock going still. First, the foraging contracts. Chickens who were ranging widely across the yard begin moving toward the center, or toward shelter. This is the first sign, and it often happens before any human in the yard has noticed anything different about the sky. Second, the vocalizations drop. The constant low-level chatter of a foraging flock, the soft clucking, the contact calls between individuals, the occasional louder commentary over a found piece of food, all of it reduces, not to silence necessarily, but noticeably quieter than the baseline. Third, and this one is subtle enough that most people miss it entirely, the birds become more vertical in their posture. They stand slightly taller, slightly more alert, scanning rather than foraging. The head angle changes. They are reading the environment rather than working it. And then, often, they go in. Not all at once, one by one or in small groups, moving into the coop or under the overhang of a structure, settling in before the rain arrives. What you are watching is not one behavior. It is a flock responding to multiple simultaneous signals, each one pointing toward the same conclusion. Something is coming. The most significant mechanism behind pre-rain behavior in chickens, and in many animals, is barometric pressure detection. And to understand why this is such a powerful signal, you need to understand what a dropping barometer actually means at a physical level. Atmospheric pressure is not abstract weather data. It is a real physical force pressing on every surface and every body in the environment. When a low-pressure system moves in ahead of rain, the pressure drops measurably, sometimes hours before the rain arrives, sometimes more, and that pressure change is detectable to animals with the right sensory equipment. Chickens have it. The mechanism is not fully mapped in chickens specifically, but it is well documented in birds generally, and the evidence in chickens is strong enough that poultry researchers and experienced keepers have described it consistently for a long time. Birds have pressure-sensitive receptors, including in the Vitali organ of the inner ear, that are capable of detecting barometric changes that humans cannot consciously perceive at all. What does a dropping barometer mean to a foraging chicken? At a behavioral level, it means the same thing it has meant to wild birds for millions of years. A low-pressure system means incoming weather. Incoming weather means reduced foraging opportunity, potential exposure to cold and wet, and elevated predation risk because rain compromises both visibility and the ability to hear a predator approaching. The correct response to a dropping barometer, baked into bird behavior over evolutionary time, is to forage hard while conditions are good and then pull in and wait. This is why the contraction of the flock often starts earlier than any visual or auditory signal would explain. They are not reading the clouds, they are reading the pressure, and the pressure often changes before the clouds arrive. Barometric pressure is the main event, but it is not the only signal chickens may be responding to before rain. Thunderstorms in particular are preceded by changes in the electromagnetic environment. Lightning activity in a storm system begins well before the storm arrives overhead, ahead, and the electromagnetic signatures of that activity travel ahead of the storm at much higher speeds than the storm itself moves. There is growing evidence that birds can detect these electromagnetic changes either through photoreceptors that are sensitive to magnetic fields or through other mechanisms that are still being studied. This is genuinely frontier science, and the picture is not complete. But the behavioral evidence, the fact that chickens and other birds respond to incoming thunderstorms earlier and more dramatically than they respond to ordinary rain, is consistent with something beyond barometric pressure alone being detected. A storm that will produce lightning seems to register differently to a flock than a storm that will not. Watch your flock the next time a thunderstorm is coming versus an ordinary rainstorm and see if you notice a difference. Many experienced chicken keepers will tell you they do. Here is a piece of this that does not get talked about enough, and it reframes the quiet in an interesting way. A flock of chickens produces constant vocalization for a specific reason. Those contact calls, that ongoing soft chatter, is how individual birds maintain awareness of where every other bird is and what they are doing. It is a real-time social tracking system. When you can hear your flock, every member of the flock can hear each other, and the network of awareness stays intact. When threat or uncertainty enters the environment, that vocalization drops for a very specific reason. Sound is a two-way signal. It tells your flockmates where you are, which is useful in normal conditions, but it also tells a predator where you are. In conditions of elevated risk, and a dropping barometer represents elevated risk because the incoming weather compromises the flock's usual defenses, the instinct is to go quiet, reduce your signal, pull in physically and acoustically. So the quiet you notice before rain is not the flock becoming inattentive, it is the opposite. It is the flock becoming more alert, contracting its exposure, reducing the signals it broadcasts into an environment that has just gotten slightly more dangerous. The silence is a form of heightened awareness, not diminished activity. There is a more grounded, less mysterious mechanism also at work here, and it is worth including because it adds a practical layer to the picture. Rising humidity ahead of rain changes the soil. Slightly damp earth, the kind that precedes rain by an hour or two as moisture begins to build in the ground ahead of a front, brings invertebrates closer to the surface. Worms move upward. Insects become more active in certain ways. The foraging conditions in the minutes and hours before rain are often genuinely better than average, which is why you will sometimes see a flock foraging with unusual intensity immediately before a storm, rather than pulling in right away. There is a window. The pressure is dropping. The humidity is rising, and the ground is producing food. A chicken who has been doing this her whole life knows, behaviorally, to work that window hard before the weather closes it. And then, when the signals say the window is closing, she pulls in. The behavior you see as a single event, the flock going quiet before rain, is actually a sequence that plays out over a period of time, with intense foraging at one end and stillness at the other, and the transition between them driven by the accumulation of sensory signals all pointing the same direction. There is a version of this story that frames what chickens are doing as purely reflexive. Pressure drops, behavior changes, stimulus, response. Nothing more than a biological program running on cue. But spend time with chickens and that framing starts to feel inadequate. What you actually observe is more flexible than a reflex. Different hens respond to the same incoming weather at different intensities. Older hens, with more experience of weather patterns in a particular yard, often respond earlier and more decisively than younger ones. A flock that has been caught out in bad weather responds differently to a dropping barometer than a flock that has always had reliable shelter to pull into. The behavior is shaped by experience, not just by the stimulus. That is learning. That is an animal using past outcomes to calibrate current responses to sensory information. It is not abstract reasoning, but it is not a simple reflex either. The flock that goes quiet before rain is integrating sensory data, social signals from other flock members, memory of previous weather events, and current environmental conditions into a behavioral response. They are reading the world more completely than we usually give them credit for. Your chickens are not weather instruments in any simple sense. They are not going to give you a reliable forecast every time, and there will be days when the flock pulls in and the rain never comes, or when a storm arrives without any obvious behavioral signal at all. They are animals responding to their environment with the sensory tools they have, not meteorologists, but they are also picking up on real things. The pressure is genuinely dropping. The electromagnetic environment is genuinely changing. The humidity is genuinely rising. When your flock contracts and quiets before a storm, they are not performing. They are responding to information you cannot access through senses you do not have, with behavior that has been refined over millions of years of birds surviving weather in the open. The next time the yard goes quiet, and you cannot quite explain why, look at the sky, but also look at your flock. They read it before you did, and they probably read it more completely. There is something worth sitting with in that. The birds you are keeping, the ones who follow you around the yard and argue over the best dust bathing spot and make a fuss over every egg, they are also continuously monitoring a layer of the physical world that is entirely invisible to you. They are living in a richer sensory environment than you will ever have access to. The quiet before rain is just the moment when that becomes obvious enough to notice. Tell me in the comments, have you seen your flock do this? Have they ever called a storm before you did? I want to hear about it. See you in the next one.